The chain snapped taut around Tyler's truck just as sunlight glinted off a brass plaque on the dash, a Supreme Court citation. The fake HOA cop froze mid-winch, his smirk vanishing in an instant. He had no idea who he was messing with. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Tyler didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm or threaten. He simply stood there, barefoot on the cool concrete, coffee mug in hand, watching two men who had no idea what they'd just stepped into. The early morning sun hadn't yet burned off the dew clinging to the lawn, and the street was hushed. Only the distant hum of sprinklers and the occasional bird call broke the silence. But the chain's rattle, metallic and invasive, sliced through it like a blade. He glanced at the truck, his truck, its navy paint polished to a mirror sheen, the chrome trim catching light like a quiet warning. That truck had hauled lumber in Wyoming, survived hurricanes in the Panhandle, and had once been blessed by a Navajo elder on a reservation in New Mexico. It wasn't just metal and rubber. It was memory, movement, miles. And now some clipboard-wielding bully had decided it didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic. Vince, the younger man, moved with the careless swagger of someone who'd never been told no by someone worth listening to. He had the look of a man who took too much pride in his laminated ID badge and the petty power it gave him in places that didn't matter. His partner, older, thicker around the middle, said nothing, avoiding Tyler's eyes as he tightened the chain. That silence spoke volumes. Tyler took a slow sip of coffee. "You know you need a court order to impound a vehicle from private residential property without consent, right?" Vince didn't even turn around. "It's in violation. HOA Code 1237, non-conforming exterior profile. Doesn't matter what statute you think applies." Tyler almost chuckled. Non-conforming exterior profile, the language of bureaucratic control, nebulous, flexible, tailor-made for abuse. He had written amicus briefs that reshaped federal precedent, advised on landmark First Amendment interpretations, and now he was being lectured on profile violations by a guy in cargo shorts. He set the mug down on the hood of the truck, slowly, deliberately. His posture remained calm, but his presence hardened, like steel under silk. "Touch that winch again, and you'll be answering to someone who helped draft the opinion in Broward County v. Vehicular Authority." That got their attention. Vince paused, mid-step. His partner froze. The silence that followed wasn't just hesitation. It was fear dressed as confusion. Tyler didn't smile. He didn't blink. He was done being polite. The plaque caught this morning light like a shard of brass truth, unapologetic and absolute. Tyler said nothing more. He didn't need to. The weight of those engraved words, presented by the office of the Chief Justice, hung heavier than anything Vince had expected to face that day. There it sat, quiet but unmistakable, a testament not to vanity, but to service few understood and even fewer respected. Vince took a half-step back, as if proximity to the emblem might burn him. He was still trying to understand the shift in air, how a moment ago he had been in control, armed with nothing more than faux authority and a clipboard attitude, and now the man in front of him wasn't just another homeowner. Tyler had felt the shift too, but not as power, as responsibility, as reckoning. It wasn't rage that stiffened his spine. It was the muscle memory of justice. Years spent poring over precedents, drafting language that would ripple through generations, understanding exactly where the limits of enforcement ended and the rights of a citizen began. He had never wanted to pull rank, but sometimes silence condones the abuse of structure. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a man can do is let it slide. The driver, a man in his 50s with calloused hands and the tired eyes of someone who'd towed too many vehicles off the wrong lots, leaned forward. His gaze flicked from the plaque to Tyler's face and back again, and in that exchange, something clicked. This wasn't a game. They weren't just harassing another retiree with a non-conforming vehicle. They were trespassing against someone who had helped write the language that defined that very boundary. "Vince," the driver muttered under his breath, his tone suddenly less casual. "We need to stop. Right now." Vince hesitated, caught in the flinch between pride and panic. But Tyler didn't move. He let the tension settle, let the silence become a cross-examination. And in that stillness, Vince saw what Tyler had always known. Authority isn't in the badge or the stitched polo. It's in knowing the law better than the people who think they can bend it. He didn't need to raise his voice. The plaque had already spoken for him. And it spoke in a language these men hadn't expected to hear. Not from a driveway, not from a quiet man in worn jeans and house shoes, and certainly not before breakfast. The chain hit the ground with a reluctant clank, metal links unwinding like a concession. Vince's hands shook slightly as he worked the ratchet loose, sweat breaking at his temples despite the cool morning breeze. His earlier swagger had evaporated, replaced now with mechanical obedience. He didn't speak. He barely breathed. Because behind him, watching with the quiet gravity of someone who had once written the policies others now fumbled to understand, stood Sylvia Hinton. And she wasn't smiling. She hadn't needed an introduction. She'd stepped from the black sedan with the composed gait of someone used to walking into chaos and bringing it to order. In her navy slacks and pressed blazer, she looked less like a bureaucrat and more like a regulator sent to clean house. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten, she just looked. And that was enough to freeze the men where they stood. Sylvia had once clerked alongside Tyler during a pivotal voting rights case. They had spent sleepless nights poring over statutory language, arguing over precedents, drinking coffee that tasted like hot regret. And now, here she was, 30 years later, summoned not by alarm, but by reputation. One call. That was all it took. "You boys been deputized by the county?" she asked, glancing pointedly at the cheap embroidered logos on their shirts. Vince opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Her eyes narrowed. "Didn't think so." Tyler stood beside her, arms at his sides, face unreadable. There was no triumph in his expression, only a slow, professional certainty. He wasn't gloating. He was witnessing accountability. "Stickers and chains aren't legal process," Sylvia added, voice calm but sharp as wire. "Not in this county. Not on this street. And definitely not on his property." The older driver mumbled something about just following orders, but Sylvia didn't take the bait. Instead, she turned to Vince, her voice lowering to something darker. "And impersonating enforcement? That's a felony. Do you know the word felony, Mr. "Vince," he said weakly. "Well, Vince, you're about 30 seconds from learning it firsthand." That was all it took. The men didn't argue. They didn't ask for clarification. They unhooked the winch, folded the ramp, and drove off with tires crunching shame into the asphalt. Sylvia watched them disappear down the street, then turned to Tyler. "You always did have a flair for timing." He offered a faint smile. "I didn't even raise my voice." "No," she replied. "You never had to." Back at City Hall, paperwork was already in motion. Allegations of authority abuse, evidence of impersonation. The HOA board wouldn't see it coming, but the law would. The community room smelled faintly of dry erase markers, old folding chairs, and nerves. The walls were lined with corkboards cluttered with outdated landscaping notices and block party flyers. But today, the bulletin space had been cleared for something else. Truth. Tyler stood at the front, not at a podium, but near the folding table where the HOA usually set out stale coffee and sugar-free cookies. There were no refreshments tonight, just reckoning. The room held about 40 people, give or take. young couples still clinging to optimism, retirees whose patience had long frayed, parents juggling childcare with neighborhood politics. Most wore the tight, furrowed expressions of people who'd been governed more than served. They weren't here for spectacle. They were here for answers. Tyler wasn't dressed for the stage. He wore what he always did: washed jeans, a button-down, boots dulled from years of use. No tie, no airs. But his presence had weight, the kind of weight that doesn't shout, it anchors. "I'm not here to accuse anyone," he began, his voice cutting clean through the hush. "I'm here because power, real power, isn't something you wear. It's something you prove, through integrity, through restraint." He paused just long enough to let the words sink in. "What happened last week wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure of trust. People pretending to hold authority acted outside the law, and they did it because no one stopped them, because too many thought that silence was safer than resistance." A few heads nodded, a few eyes dropped. "But that silence ends here," he said. "You don't need a badge to know your rights. You need courage and clarity." From the back corner, Harold Kern sat like a man dissolving. His once impenetrable posture had shriveled. The sheen of sweat along his forehead wasn't from heat. It was the slow burn of authority being peeled away, inch by inch, in front of the very people he once controlled. Tyler didn't glance at him. He didn't need to. Instead, he held up a small stack of handouts, concise, plain language guides on property law and HOA limits, the same ones left on doorsteps and tucked under windshield wipers. "This isn't about rebellion," he said. "It's about responsibility. If you're going to live under a system, you deserve to understand it and demand that it works for you, not against you." When the applause came, it wasn't raucous. It was steady, earnest, a release, not a celebration. Later that night, Tyler would find the letter taped to his mailbox, folded once, carefully. No signature. Just a sentence that meant more than any title ever had. "I sleep better now." And for the first time in years, so did he.